Most of the immigrants on the Oregon Trail had never seen a real mountain, never walked in a desert, never felt dry heat. All three were about to give them trouble. Fort Laramie marked the gateway to the Rocky Mountains. The immigrants were now 1/3 of the way to their destination. Here they rested, regrouped. Some would give up the dream, turn around and go home. But most made the decision to push ahead.
Fort Laramie was kind of the point of no return, where they could get some provisions. And most of them would decide there whether they're going to go on or not. Because once you get past there, then it was kind of tough for them to turn back.
The fort had humble beginnings. In 1834, fur trader William Sublette built a wooden fortification here and called it Fort William. There was no emigrant traffic then. Sublette's goal was trade with the Indians. He offered alcohol and tobacco in return for buffalo robes. The fort was soon sold to the American Fur Company, and they rebuilt it as an adobe structure in 1841. The fur trade was in decline by then, but the traders were as wild as ever. Rufus Sage.
Shouting, fighting, swearing, drinking, and such like interesting performances were kept up without intermission. Several made their egress from this beastly carousal minus shirts and coats, with swollen eyes, bloody noses, and empty pockets.
The fur traders would be gone from Fort Laramie by 1849, when the Army bought them out and then embarked on a major expansion. Their charge? Protect the immigrants from increasingly hostile Indians. As a result, Fort Laramie grew into a large military complex. But there was only one building here that warranted a visit by the Oregon-bound immigrants, the Post Traders Store. This was the only reliable post office within 300 miles. Supplies could be purchased here too, although prices were outrageously high. Tobacco, for instance, that could be had for a nickel in St. Louis cost $1 here. Francis Parkman.
In one bargain concluded in my presence, I calculated the profits that accrued to the fort and found that at the lowest estimate, they exceeded 1,800%.
Luckily, only a few of the immigrants needed to purchase supplies at Fort Laramie. Most wanted to sell their excess. Their overloaded wagons had become a greater and greater burden, but most held on until Fort Laramie in hopes they could earn some money for their extra supplies. But the fort trader wasn't buying. So here the emigrants underwent wholesale dumping once again. The trail near Fort Laramie was littered with heirloom furniture, stoves, food. One emigrant saw 10 tons of bacon by the side of the trail. Despite the temptation, the emigrants did not pick up this valuable litter because weight was the great enemy of their wagons.
And many immigrants report the vast numbers of articles, furniture and guns and whatnot, mining equipment, everything you can think of, scattered along the trail. They had to start lightening the load because the animals just weren't able to hack it.
But the biggest problem in the Fort Laramie vicinity was not overloaded wagons or even hostile Indians. The real worry here was a mysterious and deadly disease called cholera.
That was the greatest single problem, and there was nothing they could do about it. They got it, they were dead. The doctors that were along the trail were mainly quacks. There wasn't much that they could do. And it had one blessing: they died in a hurry. It was not a lingering death.
Cholera killed more emigrants than anything else. In a bad year, some wagon trains lost 2/3 of their people. Only one word could properly describe the trail west of Fort Laramie: crowded. That's because emigrant traffic from both sides of the Platte River merged at the fort to form a single trail going west. The congestion was sometimes unbearable.
There were many arguments about who was going to be the lead wagon, and there would be races to beat other trains to get in front of them so they wouldn't have to eat the dust. Because there's some diary excerpts where you can read that there was so much dust they couldn't even see their animals.
Some donned goggles just so they could see through the stifling clouds of dust. Evidence of the heavy wagon traffic is still clear here at Deep Rut Hill, west of Fort Laramie. Thousands of wagons would pass through on a busy day, each digging deeper into the rock. James Wilkins.
Find a great many companies continually in sight. In fact, it is one continued stream. As far as we can see, both in front and near the horizon, is dotted with white wagon covers.
Nearby at Register Cliff, the emigrants could scarcely find a place to carve their names. The rock face soon became as crowded as the trail. In the early evening, the congestion caused another problem. There was no room to camp. Some emigrants had to venture over a mile off the trail just to find an open spot to graze their cattle and start a campfire.
You could see campfires as far as you could see, both east and west. And people winding around these campfires, and horses and wagons and all, as far as you could see. Just a regular moving city.
The trail followed along the south side of the Platte for another 100 miles. Then the emigrants had to cross this mighty river one last time. The Platte here was too deep to ford. The emigrants would be forced to hire a ferryman to float them across. Some ferries were pulled across the river with long ropes. Others were simply paddled across. Howard Stansberry.
The ferry was constructed of 7 canoes dug out from cottonwood logs, fastened side by side. An emigrant had been drowned here the day before, made the 28th victim.
Further upstream, Mormon leader Brigham Young set up a ferry operation in 1847. The charge, $3 cash. The ferry immediately earned huge profits, as much as $1,500 a day. Young used the money to help build his new settlement, a place called Salt Lake City. James Pritchard arrived at the Mormon ferry on a Sunday.
At 9 a.m. we reached the ferry. We found about 175 wagons ahead of us, and we had to take our turn, which came on Wednesday morning.
Long lines at the Mormon ferry meant there would soon be competition. Here, a few miles away, John Richard built a bridge across the Platte in 1852. In his first summer, Richard took in $40,000 in tolls. Agnes Stewart.
We paid $5 for each wagon, 12.5 cents per head for the cattle, and the same for each man. The ladies went across free, for their dear little feet would not wear out the bridge.
Richard advertised his bridge as far east as Missouri. The Mormon ferry soon went out of business. But by 1859, Richard had stiff competition. A new bridge built by Louis Guinard was now open for business. Guinard's bridge was 3 times longer, more sturdily constructed, and the toll was much less. The new bridge had another advantage. It was adjacent to Fort Caspar. The fort was built in the trail's later years, primarily to protect the telegraph office here. As Indian hostility in the region increased, the fort was expanded, and about 100 soldiers were eventually garrisoned here. Unlike the other forts on the Oregon Trail, this was the site of a major Indian attack. In July of 1865, a military wagon train was heading towards the fort from the west. Suddenly, the attack came. Thousands of Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho. Only 3 of the 25 soldiers in the wagon train survived. In a separate battle, 4 more soldiers were killed the same day. But the attacks were not unprovoked. The Indians considered these raids to be retaliation for a brutal massacre a few months earlier in Sand Creek, Colorado. There, over 100 defenseless Indians were cruelly slaughtered. Toddlers were shot for target practice. Babies were scalped. A pregnant woman was sliced open. Colonel John Shivington led the Sand Creek Massacre.
Damn any man who sympathizes with Indians. I've come to kill Indians, and I believe it is right to use any means.
In 1867, less than a decade after it was constructed, Indians burned down Fort Caspar and the Platte River Bridge. After getting across the Platte, the emigrants continued southwest toward the Sweetwater River. Their trek through the Rocky Mountains was underway. Reverend Parrish.
A fine, clear morning. The country around is quite romantic, for the rocks, mountains, and plains, the sun with its native majesty beautifying the whole. O my soul, read in nature, nature's God.
50 miles after crossing the Platte, the emigrants arrived at the great bulletin board of the West, Independence Rock. On a warm summer evening, hundreds of emigrants would swarm all over the rock, chiseling messages to others following behind, or just carving their names. Many of the emigrants arrived here on the 4th of July, and that was cause for celebration. Pies were baked, revelry was shared. But they never rested for long, and after a day of festivities, the western trek continued following the Sweetwater River. A few miles west of Independence Rock, the Sweetwater threads its way through a narrow canyon, Devil's Gate. But the wagons never passed through the chasm. They wisely detoured around it. The emigrants were now in a full-fledged desert. Sand was everywhere, and the wagon wheels dug deep. The animals, fatigued, hot, had a difficult pull. It wasn't easy for people either. The temperature could reach 100 degrees, and there was no shade, no relief. Then, a miracle. In the middle of the desert, there was ice. Here at Ice Slough, the bog acted as an insulator to preserve ice from the previous winter. It was a welcome relief, a tall tale come true. 60 miles later, the most important landmark on the trail, the key to westward migration, South Pass. There's no narrow gorge here. This gap in the Rockies is miles wide. Without South Pass, wagon travel across the continent would have been impossible, and Oregon and California would probably not be part of the United States today.
We wouldn't have tied, quote, the western part and the eastern part of the country together. We wouldn't have populated the western part. Whether this is good or bad, I guess it depends on your point of view. It may have remained British, or it may have remained Mexican.
South Pass crossed the Continental Divide and hence marked the boundary between the United States and Oregon country. Even though the emigrants were now in Oregon, there was no reason to celebrate. They were still only halfway to their destination. There was 1,000 miles yet to travel. Ahead in the endless desert, many would die. But it wasn't the heat that killed them. The most common cause of death in this desert was drowning. In 1850 alone, 37 people drowned trying to get across the Green River. There were drownings at all the major crossings, but this river was especially deadly. John B. Hill was one of the lucky ones.
The ferryman allowed too many passengers to get in the boat, and the water came within 2 inches of the gunwale. He ordered every man to stand steady as the boat was liable to swamp. When we were nearly across, the edge of the boat dipped. I thought the boat would be swamped instantly and drowned every last one of us.
Those who didn't drown were usually fleeced. There were up to 50 different ferries operating here, but the competition didn't lead to lower prices. The charge ranged up to $16, almost the price of an oxen. For most, it was the most expensive river crossing on the trail. One ferry earned $65,000 in just one summer. The emigrants complained bitterly. However, one man here earned the unanimous respect and admiration of the emigrants, Chief Washakie. His Shoshone tribe plucked drowning emigrants out of the river, rounded up lost cattle, and provided help to travelers throughout the region. After the Green River came Fort Bridger. Many emigrants were hoping to find a civilized outpost, perhaps something similar to Fort Laramie, but they were in for quite a surprise. Joel Palmer.
It is built of poles and dabbed with mud. It is a shabby concern. Here are about 25 lodges of Indians, or rather white trappers' lodges, occupied by their Indian wives. They have a good supply of skins, coats, moccasins, which they trade for flour, coffee, sugar, etc.
The fort was built in 1843 specifically to serve the emigrant traffic. Unlike Fort Kearny and Fort Laramie, this fort was privately owned and operated by the legendary Jim Bridger.
I have established a small fort with blacksmith shop and iron in the road of the emigrants. They, in coming out, are generally well supplied with money. By the time they get there, are in want of all kinds of supplies.
One key to Fort Bridger's success was its location. Unlike the rest of the region, this spot had plenty of trees and fresh water. There was even coal nearby. Bridger didn't operate his fort for very long. Within a decade, he was forced out by the West's new power broker, Brigham Young, leader of the Mormons. Young wanted the fort as a way station for the wave of Mormons now heading west. Beginning in 1847, thousands of Mormons started streaming west. They followed roughly the same route as the Oregon emigrants, up to Fort Bridger. Here, Oregon-bound pioneers coursed northward, while the Mormons struck southwest to the valley of the Great Salt Lake. Because they couldn't afford oxen, many Mormons pulled their makeshift carts by hand, 1,400 miles. 70,000 made the overland trip, and the Mormon Church soon dominated much of the West. The Mormons called their empire Deseret, and it soon encompassed land all the way to the Pacific. There was talk of secession from the Union. The federal government was not happy with the growing Mormon autonomy. In 1857, President Buchanan sent troops west along the Oregon Trail. Their mission? Wrest control from Mormon leader Brigham Young. Young responded with a series of guerrilla attacks against the approaching military, including the burning of Fort Bridger. Brigham Young.
Use every exertion to stampede their animals, set fire to their wagon trains. Keep them from sleeping by night surprises.
In the end, there was a peaceful settlement. Fort Bridger was the only military casualty of the so-called Mormon War. Yet the burned fort was not a great loss for the Oregon-bound emigrants. The opening of several shortcuts had put Fort Bridger 100 miles out of the way. So, by now, most of the emigrants were avoiding the fort anyway. The first shortcut was opened in 1844, the Sublette Cutoff. It shortened the road to Oregon by 46 miles. But there was little water along this alternate route, making the journey difficult. The Slate Creek Cutoff solved that problem, but the best cutoff of all was the federally built Lander Road, a marvel of Western Trail construction. Unfortunately, it was not finished until 1859. By then, most of the emigrant traffic had already passed. Except for those who took the Lander Road, all the emigrants soon faced a major obstacle, known simply as Big Hill. Many felt this was the most difficult descent on the entire route. Here, like many places, the wagons went over the top of the hill rather than along the side. That's because any sideways tilt would tip over the top-heavy wagons. To the west, Soda Springs. Hot water shot into the air. Strange sights were everywhere. William Scott.
The Soda Springs is quite a curiosity. There is a great many of them just boiling right up out of the ground. I drank a whole gallon of it.
60 miles further on was Fort Hall, an important stop for the emigrants in the trail's early years. Yet few who passed through this fort knew the strange reason it was built, by a man named Nathaniel Wyeth. Wyeth began with a grand money-making scheme. He and 70 men would haul supplies to the 1832 fur trappers' rendezvous, reap huge profits, then push west to the Columbia, where they would set up a fishery and export salmon to Hawaii and New England. From the beginning, almost nothing went right. After months of travel, Wyeth arrived at the rendezvous, but no one would buy his goods. Frustrated, disillusioned, his last-ditch plan was to build a fort nearby. Its purpose? To serve as a base of operations to get rid of Wyeth's excess supplies by selling them to nearby Indians and trappers. When Wyeth's men finished Fort Hall in 1834, it stood as the only American outpost in the entire Oregon country. Osborne Russell.
On the 4th of August, the fort was completed, and on the 5th, the stars and stripes were unfurled at sunrise in the center of a savage and uncivilized country over an American trading post.
But it did not stay American very long. Wyeth's other ventures failed, and by 1837 he had sold the fort to the huge Hudson's Bay Company. The British flag now flew over Fort Hall. For the next 5 years, Fort Hall was the end of the trail, at least for wagons. The British here told the emigrants to leave their wagons behind. The road to the west was too difficult. Only pack animals could make it, they said. The emigrants listened and agreed for a while. But all that changed in 1843. James Nesmith.
Captain Grant, then in charge of the Hudson Bay Company at Fort Hall, endeavored to dissuade us from proceeding further with our wagons and showed us the wagons that the emigrants of the preceding year had abandoned as evidence of the impracticability of our determination. Dr. Whitman was persistent in his assertions that wagons could proceed.
This time, the emigrants ignored the British and followed Marcus Whitman's advice. And so, in 1843, 200 wagons rolled west from Fort Hall. It was an historic decision. The travelers eventually arrived in the Willamette Valley safely, proving wagons could make it all the way. Word spread around the country, and the trickle of emigrants became a flood. It was only a matter of time before the American flag would fly here again, not just over Fort Hall, but over the entire Pacific Northwest.
The migrations are what ensured Oregon going to the United States. We were able to populate Oregon, and I think that was the biggest factor. I think Britain realized that it would be in for an awful long struggle and might even have to go to war if they'd be bound to lose. So I think diplomatically they decided to settle for the present boundary we have along the north.